What does the character Jade and your credit card have in common? They'll eventually have you part ways with everything you own, but at least you're gonna have a fun ride on the way.
Oh my god! But if you close your eyes, does it almost feel like
Hey, I'm Gladius, and welcome to my complete Jade guide. She's all about issuing contracts and maximizing profit. The more enemies there are, the better. Jade will not waste time with any single target fights, but don't be mistaken to think she can only function in pure fiction. Let's talk about her kit and exactly how to build her. The core mechanic of Jade is a follow-up attack, and that is over half of her overall damage output. This is part of her talent. This is an all-target attack that has a decent multiplier and gets greatly amplified further by the rest of her kit. To trigger this follow-up attack, she needs to accumulate and expend 8 charge points. But don't worry, these charges are not capped and can go over the required 8, so extra charges are never wasted. You can bet Jade keeps a close eye on every dollar she is owed. Whenever Jade or an ally that is assigned to be the debt collector attacks, Jade accumulates 1 charge point for every enemy hit by the attack. Jade herself can be assigned as the debt collector and essentially double her own charge points from attacking, but that will not be the common strategy, as her own follow-up attack itself doesn't generate these charges. The talent is a huge stacking buff called Pawned Assets. It stacks up every time Jade triggers her follow-up attacks. With the help of other ascension traces and her technique, she stacks up this talent super quick, within a couple of turns. And for the rest of the battle, she'll permanently gain 120% crit damage and 25% attack. And it's fully automated, so you don't have to do anything special. Jade's skill is the ability that actually assigns one ally to be the debt collector. This will last for 3 turns, and you can't swap targets until then. Which means Jade is skill point positive and very suitable in a dual DPS team comp. The target ally with debt collector will trigger Jade's coordinated damage, a 25% multiplier for every enemy hit by their attacks. This damage doesn't count as an individual attack or FUA, so there will be no additional toughness damage as well. Now, if the debt collector is not Jade herself, they also receive a 30 speed buff and consume 2% of their max HP whenever they attack. The HP loss is pretty inconsequential. If anything, it actually helps to enable a lot of conditions like blessings from simulated universe or other HP loss synergies. Jade's basic attack gets some special treatment here. It's the first basic attack to have a blast radius targeting with a decent multiplier as well. She will use her basic attacks quite a bit, giving up to 3 charge points for her follow-up attacks if you hit 3 targets. The damage itself though, won't be that impressive. Jade's ultimate is really strong, doing 240% multiplier to all target, but that's not all. It increases the multiplier for her next 2 FUAs by 80%. It does come at a higher cost than normal of 140, but between FUAs giving her 10 energy per trigger and landing kills on multiple targets, her ult will be up a lot more than you'd expect. This ult can also hit up to 5 targets, giving Jade many charge points for her talent. So the trace priorities for Jade will be picking up the Ascension traces first, of course, then talent, then the ultimate. You don't want to ignore the basic attack and skill completely, but they should be the last in line. An example of endgame trace levels is level 10 talent, level 9 ultimate, level 7 basic, and skill. For optimal team output, Jade's debt collector is almost always given to another unit with heavy AoE capabilities and high frequency of attacks. These are mostly DPS characters, but nihility characters like Pella or jiaoqiu can also be the debt collector. And especially in dual DPS setups, Jade's best teams always have a team-wide buffing harmony character, with Jade doing most of the damage of course, as long as there are 3 or more enemy targets. It's not a good idea to bring Jade to a fight with just 1 target though, which is a very rare scenario compared to content with 3 or more enemies. Jade's whole kit revolves around hitting as many targets as possible and landing kills. It's a positive feedback loop that breaks down when no more enemies are spawning into battle. Less than half of her energy actually comes from taking her own turns. With the right setup, just having 3 targets is enough for her to output very competitive damage, with over half of it being her follow-up attacks, and her ultimate claiming a fair amount of credit for buffing the FUAs. She might be using her basic attacks for the most part, but even the coordinated damage from her skill ends up doing more damage. Knowing her playstyle and damage composition, we can start optimizing her relics and stats. For main stats, Chess piece, you'll always want crit rate. Jade is in a rare situation where she buffs herself so much crit damage that building crit rate heavily outweighs building crit damage. For boots, attack percent is by far the best option. Most of her attacks are dished outside of her turns. Her teammate speed will actually matter way more. Speed doesn't even help her charge her ult all that much, because the majority of the energy income doesn't actually come from her taking turns. For the orb slot, if you're just looking at her stats at default, attack percent is really close to quantum damage, but because Jade's best team builds and easier to obtain light cones offer a lot of attack percent, quantum damage ends up being the better option in most cases. For rope, attack percent is optimal, which is almost twice as good on average than an ERR rope. This chart shows the performance of a single substat. It gives us a clear picture of what Jade won and what the priority is. Due to how lopsided Jade's crit damage is, this is one of the rare situations where I value crit rate way more than crit damage. Now for the relic set bonuses, what are we looking for? For the outer 4-piece, the best in slot is pretty much tied between the Grand Duke and the OG Quantum set. The multi-hit nature of Jade's FUA makes Grand Duke very consistent even if only 3 targets are being hit. The Quantum set though varies a little more depending on if enemies are weak to Quantum and if you bring other sources of defense shred. The new supposedly follow-up set is not a perfect match for Jade, but the 6% crit rate at baseline is really valuable to balance out her crit ratio. A 2-piece is about 8% behind the best options. Now for planar ornaments, I consider any set of the Salsato, the Doran Dynasty, and the Sigonia to be tied for best in slot. The Salsato being the easiest to build around, giving a massive 8% crit rate. When it comes to light cones, Jade doesn't want anything too gimmicky, so she'll have a lot of amazing options to choose from. Her signature is about 15% ahead of the secondary options, which is a bit less than the typical 20, but the best part of the signature is the 16% crit rate, which helps offset the imbalance of her crit ratio. The next best options we have are the Himiko light cone from the standard pulls, the Battle Pass light cone, and the Genius's Repose. All of which are not exactly free to play, but for light spenders and those that are lucky enough to get superimpositions, these are amazing options. I'm not going to spend too much time talking about the other limited 5-star light cones, it's not super obtainable. But we do have the new Herta Shop Year Edition light cone and the good old Seriousness of Breakfast, both of which can be maxed out for free. A big part of the Herta Shop light cone Eternal Calculus is actually the 16% speed, which is not ideal for Jade. But given it's likely Jade will be played with other Year Edition characters, you can actually swap them around to better suit their needs. The bottom line for Jade ends with Breakfast, being easily obtainable at max superimposition. Jade's function and power feels very complete at E0. She doesn't have any crazy early Eidolons damage-wise, and only becomes noticeable at E6. Even though Jade's E1 does not bring a significant increase for the intended 3 target fights, it is still the coolest Eidolon by far, enabling different team builds. The important part of this Eidolon is that it allows the deck collector to always generate 3 charges at minimum for Jade's talent, even if only 1 target is being hit by the attack. Single target hunt characters have some of the highest attack frequencies in this game, and this completely changes Jade's options for a deck collector teammate. But don't be mistaken though, Jade's E1 doesn't change the fact that she still prefers content with as many enemies as possible for her own sake. The next notable Eidolon is all the way to E6, where her power goes to the next level. A 20% res pen is a lot of damage already, but more importantly, Jade can also be the deck collector alongside another teammate, essentially doubling her own charge point contributions, resulting in much more FUAs. Now, team building is the most fun part of Jade and what makes her unique. The deck collector mechanic enables many fun team comp synergies. The most flexible team slot here is the sustain. Jade is not gimmicky enough to require this character to do anything fancy. And depending on how easy the content is, sometimes you can get away with not using one. That being said though, providing buffs for Jade is much appreciated. Top choices are Fuxuan, who gives a much needed crit rate buff, Huohuo, who gives extra energy and attack percent. Aventurine fits perfectly in an FUA team archetype. He's not doing so much for Jade per se, but he is the perfect match for Robin, who happens to be Jade's best support. Speaking of supports, Harmony characters are the best in this team slot. Statistically, they're the best amplifiers for team damage. Robin just happens to be the best support simply because she provides the most amount of buffs for your team, especially when follow-up attacking fixes energy issues for Robin. Runmei is a close second. Asta and Pella are decent substitutes. The trend is about buffing the whole team's damage, which is why hypercarry supports are less preferred like Bronya or Tingyun. The best part about playing Jade is assigning a deck collector on the team. To get the most charges for Jade, you have to consider two factors for the deck collector. One, how frequent are their attacks? Typically, follow-up units have way more. And second, how many targets can they hit? Which is why her E1 is so broken, it essentially removes this second part from the equation. The most mundane way to play Jade is actually assigning herself as the deck collector. Don't get me wrong, she's good at multi-targeting, but still lacks the frequency of attacks. Her FUA does not count towards her own charge points. Well, good thing is she's SP friendly, so Bronya can somewhat fix this playstyle. Himiko has high multi-target damage and frequency, as long as the majority of the enemies are weak to fire, because if not, her damage falls off a cliff. Herta, on the other hand, does not require the enemy to be weak to ice, as much as she wants as many enemies to spawn as possible, making game modes like Pure Fiction to be almost required. Other Erudition characters with no or little follow-up attacks are at a clear disadvantage. But someone like Argenti can still spam his ultimate and have a high frequency, so it's okay for Pure Fiction style combat. The character that gets the most from being Jade's deck collector is Blade. He fully utilizes the HP drain mechanic and dishes out the best personal damage, and he isn't even limited by type weakness or having a lot of targets. The main drawback is how reliant he is on Bronya, who takes up a team slot. Similar to Herta, Clara is surprisingly good as a deck collector as long as it's Pure Fiction. A 2-turn ult Pella with a windset and speed build becomes a good deck collector and makes Jade do hypercarry levels of damage. Having Jade's E1 massively buffs the synergy even further to a point where Pella is one of the best teammates. Speaking of Jade's E1, it completely enables Topaz to be one of the best teammates, from not being viable at all to being one of the best. Due to how frequent Topaz can attack, the same concept applies to other high-frequent hunt characters. Jade's E1 essentially opens a new path of characters she can play with. Now, if you wanted to invest more into Jade, should you go for E1 or her signature Lycon? If you're like me and you value flexibility of team building, I value E1 way more for that reason. But if you just want raw power and play Jade with her intended AoE deck collectors, then E1 is not as big of a deal and you might as well go for her signature. Overall though, Jade doesn't need either to function. She has an amazing unit in Pure Fiction and holds her own weight in content with 3 or more enemies. Now good luck with your pulls if you're going for her. My name is Gladius. Thank you for watching. Until next time.